All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be discussing The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, published 1920. So, The Age of Innocence is a book that I've actually taught before in my creative writing class, and so I'm really excited to talk about it here. I think it's a novel that does a lot of things extremely well. Edith Wharton is a master of scenes. And so I love teaching this novel because it has so many wonderful scenes, and she does every element of craft perfectly. Everything from the characterization, to the dialogue, to the setting. But I think beyond just that, and beyond kind of the lyricism of her sentences, all of which we're going to get into, what I think makes Edith Wharton extraordinary, what I think makes her deservedly one of the best canonical American writers, is that, as with a lot of the other writers that we've talked about on this podcast, she does an excellent job of connecting her specific narrative, her specific story, to a larger historical trajectory, a larger historical context. I mean, essentially, The Age of Innocence is a simple story on its surface, a simple story of a love triangle between three characters: Newland Archer, his fiancée May, and Ellen Olenska, this enigmatic, non-conforming member of this 19th century American society who Newland is attracted to primarily because she goes against so many of the social conventions of the time. And so, on the surface, it's a relatively simple story, right? A classic kind of love triangle. But Edith Wharton is not just telling a simple romance, not just telling a simple kind of tragic romance. She wants to do something more. She wants to use her characters to say something profound about the passage of time and about the nature of historical change. And that's why I think The Age of Innocence is a masterpiece, not just because of the emotional weight of the story, which is, it's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful, moving story, but also because of how that story comments on the way America changes between the 1870s, which is when the novel is set, and the 1920s, when Edith Wharton wrote it. And as we're going to talk about, the ending in particular does a masterful job of bringing this all together. This is obviously very similar to some of the other novels we've talked about on this podcast. I praised Evelyn Waugh and Brideshead Revisited for much of the same reasons, right? That he was able, in his novel, to capture the experience of the passage of time. That, for me, is one of the most important things that a writer can do. And that, I think, is what separates good novels from great novels. The great novels are the ones that have something to say about the time period that their authors lived in, something to say about the world, something to say about history, quite often. I think time and the passage of time is, in fact, one of the most profound experiences that anyone goes through. And some of the best writers are the ones who capture what that experience can feel like. So let's talk about The Age of Innocence. And I think the best way to start is to give the important context, right? That this book came out in 1920, but it's about the 1870s. So for Edith Wharton, it's kind of like historical fiction almost, right? Edith Wharton was born in 1862. So the world that she depicts in The Age of Innocence is the world of her childhood. She's looking back at her childhood, looking at the values of her childhood, and, as we're going to see, critiquing those values from the vantage point of the 1920s. Or I guess we could say the vantage point of the 1910s, since this was published in 1920. But either way, the point remains the same. The world, obviously, America specifically, changed dramatically, right, in those 40 years. Sometimes it's hard for us in the modern world to appreciate it because we might think, oh, she's just writing about her own time period, the 1870s. But no, she is writing what to us is kind of the equivalent of historical fiction. It's as if someone today was writing about the 1980s, right, or the 1990s. We are looking back at a conscious distance, and that's what she's doing. We see this kind of right away at the beginning. And I want to just look at the first few paragraphs, which set up a few things that I think are key to understanding this novel. First, it sets up the time period, but it also sets up the tone. This voice that Wharton uses throughout the novel, slightly ironic, glib, humorous to some extent, but in a very subtle kind of way. A voice that very subtly seems to judge the time period. So take a look at the first few paragraphs. On a January evening of the early 70s, Christine Nielsen was singing in Faust at the Academy of Music in New York. Though there was already talk of the erection, in remote metropolitan distances above the 40s, of a new opera house, which should compete in costliness and splendor with those of the great European capitals, the world of fashion was still content to reassemble every winter in the shabby red and gold boxes of the sociable old academy. Conservatives cherished it for being small and inconvenient, and thus keeping out the new people, whom New York was beginning to dread and yet be drawn to. And the sentimental clung to it for its historic associations, and the musical for its excellent acoustics, always so problematic a quality in halls built for the hearing of music. So there's a kind of humor to her depiction of the old Academy of Music in New York. She kind of says later they're going to build, right, an opera house. But for now, this is where people come to listen to opera. And she kind of makes fun of it for being small and inconvenient, for keeping out the new people. She kind of also seems to critique people who have a sentimental attachment to it for historical associations. So I wanted to read that opening just to kind of establish that Edith Wharton does not start this novel with the portrait of Newland Archer, our protagonist, though she's going to get to him very quickly. Instead, she chooses to start with a depiction of the music hall and its social significance, right? How it relates to the society, which is her way of telling us that even though this is going to be a novel about specific people, it is really a novel about New York society at a particular time. And when we think about the first chapter, it continues this same trend because, in the first chapter, we are introduced to Newland. We learn that he's engaged to May Welland and that he's in love with her. But we are also introduced to two minor characters who are going to have a key place in the novel. The first is this man named Lawrence Lefferts, who is described in this opening chapter as the foremost authority on form in New York. And she kind of makes fun of this figure who is important in New York society at the time for his aesthetic judgments. There's a certain kind of ironic relish that Wharton seems to take in describing this man who thinks he's so important and whose judgment and taste is considered so important. He's a minor character ultimately, but he's going to kind of keep cropping up at key moments to represent society, to represent what do people at the time think. He's kind of the gossipy one. And this is a novel in which gossip and what people are saying about Newland and later about Ellen Olenska is obviously very important. So it makes sense that she sets him up in a place of prominence in the first chapter. So I want to just take a look at this paragraph where Larry Lefferts judges Ellen Olenska. So this is towards the end of the first chapter. "Well, upon my soul," exclaimed Lawrence Lefferts, turning his opera glass abruptly away from the stage. Lawrence Lefferts was, on the whole, the foremost authority on form in New York. He had probably devoted more time than anyone else to the study of this intricate and fascinating question. But study alone could not account for his complete and easy competence. One had only to look at him, from the slant of his bald forehead and the curve of his beautiful fair mustache, to the long patent leather feet at the other end of his lean and elegant person, to feel that the knowledge of form must be congenital in anyone who knew how to wear such good clothes so carelessly and carry such height with so much lounging grace. As a young admirer had once said of him, "If anybody can tell a fellow just when to wear a black tie with evening clothes and when not to, it's Larry Lefferts." And on the question of pumps versus patent leather Oxfords, his authority had never been disputed. Now, there is obviously, again, that ironic relish to Edith Wharton's tone. she's emphasizing that, yeah, people consider Lawrence Lefferts an authority on form, but in the way she writes that sentence, she's also making fun of him a little bit. She's sort of saying, from our point of view in 1920, he's a little bit silly looking, right? He's a little bit old-fashioned, right? To a reader in 1920, this description would have been very comical, because the idea that a person like this was the height of fashion at the time, it was meant to be kind of a joke about the values of New York in the 1870s that Edith Wharton is looking back on. Now, what the point, though, of bringing him up, right, is that what Larry Lefferts is reacting to here is the appearance of Ellen Olenska, who's going to be the second key protagonist of the novel, alongside Newland, right? The one he's in love with, the object of his affection, of his desire. So let's look at this next paragraph where Newland first notices her. Now, he knows who she is, right? They've known each other from childhood, but he sees her again for the first time in a while here. Newland Archer, following Lefferts' glance, saw with surprise that his exclamation had been occasioned by the entry of a new figure into old Mrs. Mingott's box. It was that of a slim young woman, a little less tall than May Welland. Notice he's already comparing her to May, his fiancée. With brown hair growing in close curls about her temples and held in place by a narrow band of diamonds. The suggestion of this headdress, which gave her what was then called a Josephine look, was carried out in the cut of the dark blue velvet gown, rather theatrically caught up under her bosom by a girdle with a large old-fashioned clasp. The wearer of this unusual dress, who seemed quite unconscious of the attention it was attracting, stood a moment in the center of the box, discussing with Mrs. Welland the propriety of taking the latter's place in the front right-hand corner. So the point is that Larry Lefferts has noticed that Ellen Olenska has appeared wearing a slightly unusual dress, right? She's standing out from the crowd. And that, of course, is who her character is. She is the nonconformist. She is the unconventional one who pushes back against New York society's social norms. And this minor character, Lawrence Lefferts, clearly has been established as the authority on those social norms, at least in the context of fashion. The other character who we are introduced to the other very minor character who we're introduced to in this opening chapter is a man named Mr. Sillerton Jackson. And so Edith Wharton spends a little time describing him. He's kind of a counterpart to Lawrence Lefferts. He is another important figure in New York society, but he is interested in family, right? He is interested in family trees. And so the point here is that in this opening chapter, we're not only introduced to Newland Archer, our protagonist, as well as Ellen Olenska, the woman who he's going to be drawn to, the unconventional one who challenges society's expectations. But Edith Wharton makes sure to also introduce these minor characters, Lawrence Lefferts and Mr. Sillerton Jackson, who represent New York society. And again, this is part of why Edith Wharton is such a good writer, is she understands that she is not just telling a narrative about three characters. She is saying something about New York in the 1870s. So, in terms of the passages that I want to look at, right, there's quite a lot we could focus our attention on, but obviously the drive of the novel, especially in the first half, is the tension between Newland and Ellen Olenska. That is what gives the novel, in this first part, its friction, right? Its kind of erotic tension, is the will they, won't they kind of tension that is established between the two of them. And Edith Wharton does an excellent job of letting this tension build gradually, slowly, and carefully over the course of several scenes. Like I said, Edith Wharton is excellent when it comes to scenes. And so I want to just look at one or two scenes, which really I think are exemplary moments of Edith Wharton's craft and of the narrative tension, right, that the first half of the novel is setting up. So the first one is, there is a scene in which Newland Archer visits Ellen Olenska in her room. And this is kind of a key moment because he actually gets to see her in a particularly intimate setting. And we get to see how Ellen Olenska decorates her room. And once again, the emphasis is on unconventionality. The emphasis is that the kinds of things she chooses to display are not what everyone else displays in this novel. They go against society. And that's going to be a theme that Edith Wharton returns to, right, over and over again. So let's take a look at this moment. So this is in chapter 9. Newland has come to visit her, to speak with her, and this is one scene in their sort of long flirtation that we're seeing develop. But basically, the maid lets him in, and she goes to look for Ellen, and he gets to sort of look around Ellen's room, this room, by himself and kind of judge what he sees. And we, as readers, are also getting to do the same thing. So what he saw, meanwhile, with the help of the lamp, was the faded, shadowy charm of a room unlike any room he had known. He knew that the Countess Olenska had brought some of her possessions with her, bits of wreckage, she called them, and these, he supposed, were represented by some small, slender tables of dark wood, a delicate little Greek bronze on the chimney-piece, and a stretch of red damask nailed on the discolored wallpaper, behind a couple of Italian-looking pictures in old frames. Newland Archer prided himself on his knowledge of Italian art. His boyhood had been saturated with Ruskin, and he had read all the latest books: John Addington Symonds, Vernon Lee's Euphorion, the essays of P.G. Hamerton, and a wonderful new volume called The Renaissance by Walter Pater. He talked easily of Botticelli, and spoke of Fra Angelica with a faint condescension. But these pictures bewildered him, for they were like nothing that he was accustomed to look at, and therefore able to see, when he traveled in Italy. And perhaps, also, his powers of observation were impaired by the oddness of finding himself in this strange, empty house, where apparently no one expected him. He was sorry that he had not told May Welland of Countess Olenska's request, and a little disturbed by the thought that his betrothed might come in to see her cousin. What would she think if she found him sitting there, with the air of intimacy implied by waiting alone in the dusk at a lady's fireside? So Edith Wharton, of course, knows what she's doing. She's setting up this tension around possible infidelity, right? Ellen, by the way, is May's cousin, so that adds like a little wrinkle to this whole thing. And Newland is already worrying. What if May comes in and sees me sitting here in what seems like a very intimate situation? Right? The reason he's here is nothing untoward as of yet. He's simply here to answer a request that Ellen Olenska made of him. But obviously, he's excited to be here, and clearly he's thinking of something illicit, right? And again, just this is kind of Edith Wharton being so good at creating this tension. But notice also the descriptions of the room, right? The emphasis here is on the unconventional Italian pictures that Ellen Olenska has, which are different from anything the more conventional Newland is familiar with, despite all the books that he's read on the subject. So continuing on, right, more descriptions of the room. The atmosphere of the room, so I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. The atmosphere of the room was so different from any he had ever breathed that self-consciousness vanished in the sense of adventure. That, by the way, is such a key phrase, right? Ellen Olenska brings out a different side of Newland. This is why their love story, I think, is so compelling. Because even though obviously Newland is, he's betraying his wife May, and some people might read this novel and side more with May, the point, though, is that Newland's self-consciousness seems to vanish when he's in Ellen's presence. And that's important, right? Edith Wharton wants us, I think, to side with Newland and Ellen, because their love story is the tragic love story, right, of this novel, and they represent the kind of unconventionality and nonconformity that I think Edith Wharton would have endorsed, as opposed to someone like May. However sad her story is, as we're going to see, she represents conventionality. And Edith Wharton is very clear about that in the way she's going to describe May, the way she has described May. Continuing on here, though. He had been before in drawing rooms hung with red damask, with pictures of the Italian school. What struck him was the way in which Medora Manson's shabby hired house, with its blighted background of pampas grass and Rogers statuettes, had, by a turn of the hand and the skillful use of a few properties, been transformed into something intimate, foreign, subtly suggestive of old romantic scenes and sentiments. He tried to analyze the trick, to find a clue to it in the way the chairs and tables were grouped, in the fact that only 2 Jacqueminot roses, of which nobody ever bought less than a dozen, had been placed in the slender vase at his elbow, and in the vague, pervading perfume that was not what one put on handkerchiefs, but rather like the scent of some far-off bazaar, a smell made up of Turkish coffee and ambergris and dried roses. So Wharton, right, masterfully kind of mixes Newland Archer's impressions with very specific sensory details. The smell, obviously, that is associated with the Near East, right, with Turkey, with bazaars. Vaguely exotic and foreign, right, to emphasize that Ellen Olenska is not part of society. She is European, or even beyond Europe, right, all the way to Turkey. In this novel, Europe and European values are often presented as antithetical to the more conservative American New York society of 1870. But notice just the way all of these details fuse together to emphasize Ellen Olenska's nonconformity. I really like the detail of the 2 roses. So the idea here is that normally, if you buy these roses, you buy a dozen or more, right? That's the conventional thing to do. Ellen Olenska has chosen to buy just 2. That's obviously very suggestive, right, given where this novel is headed. Now, the next paragraph is really interesting because now he contrasts this room with what he imagines May's drawing room is going to look like when they get married and start living together. His mind wandered away to the question of what May's drawing room would look like. He knew that Mr. Welland, who was behaving very handsomely, already had his eye on a newly built house in East 39th Street. The neighborhood was thought remote, and the house was built in a ghastly greenish-yellow stone that the younger architects were beginning to employ as a protest against the brownstone, of which the uniform hue coated New York like a cold chocolate sauce. But the plumbing was perfect. Archer would have liked to travel, to put off the housing question, but though the Wellands approved of an extended European honeymoon, perhaps even a winter in Egypt, they were firm as to the need of a house for the returning couple. The young man felt that his fate was sealed. For the rest of his life, he would go up every evening between the cast-iron railings of that greenish-yellow doorstep and pass through a Pompeian vestibule into a hall with a wainscoting of varnished yellow wood. But beyond that, his imagination could not travel. He knew the drawing room above had a bay window, but he could not fancy how May would deal with it. She submitted cheerfully to the purple satin and yellow tuftings of the Welland drawing room, to its sham buhl tables and gilt vitrines full of modern sacks. He saw no reason to suppose that she would want anything different in her own house, and his only comfort was to reflect that she would probably let him arrange his library as he pleased, which would be, of course, with sincere Eastlake furniture, in the plain new bookcases without glass doors. So as he's reflecting, right, on what his houses look like, notice how sad he feels. Listen to the language that he uses to describe his impending, like, the house that he's going to live in with his wife, right? He says, the young man felt that his fate was sealed. He hasn't even started his affair with Ellen Olenska yet, and he's already depressed about the idea of life with May. Again, just being in the presence of Ellen Olenska's room, the romance of it, right? The romance of the way it's arranged has really moved Newland and has led him to question conventionality, has led him to wonder why all of these choices that May is going to make have to be made in that way, all these kind of decorative choices. One of the things about this novel, Edith Wharton obviously knows a lot about the incredibly specific social kind of codes of this world. Look at all the little references that are made. The buhl tables, modern sacks, a Pompeian vestibule. A lot of these to us are kind of meaningless phrases, right? Unless you're like an expert in 19th century antiquities or 19th century interior design. A lot of this will be sort of meaningless, but the point is, in its specificity, it represents fashion, right? It represents what is in fashion and in style. And the whole point of this novel that Edith Wharton wants us to take away, obviously, is that she wants to kind of question and bring down this fashionable world, to kind of break it down by saying, But what if you could live a more authentic life, a more unconventional and real life, like Ellen Olenska lives and like Newland Archer now seems to want to live? Okay, so a few of the other kind of key moments that I want to look at in the first half of the novel, again, have a lot to do with the sort of build-up, right, of Newland and Ellen Olenska's flirtation. We're not going to look at every one of these scenes, because again, I could quote from this novel for hours and hours and hours, right? But let's jump ahead to chapter 15. So in this section, basically, they go to visit the van der Luydens, this Dutch family who live kind of in a place called Schuytercliff, kind of outside of New York City. One thing that I think is really significant is the way Edith Wharton touches on these key details of American history. So the Dutch, one of the groups of European settlers who predated, obviously, the English in New York and who sort of represent the earliest side of New York history. Later, there's even going to be a scene in St. Augustine, Florida, which, if you know anything about American history, that was the first Spanish settlement in what would later become the United States. So Edith Wharton is choosing these locations very carefully and very specifically. And there's a moment in this chapter, right, where, so Newland is visiting this family, Ellen Olenska is also here, right? And again, this is part of the long kind of courtship between Ellen and Newland, the long flirtation that's building up to something. Each one of these scenes is escalating the tension, escalating the tension, escalating the tension. And so, they have a moment together in the house of the old patroon, which is this old Dutch house on the property. And again, Edith Wharton is very specific with her locations. She chooses this house because it represents history. And this is something I'm going to come back to a lot as we analyze these later scenes in the novel. Wharton is not just telling a love story, as I've said. She is making a comment on history. She is talking about American history. So it makes complete sense, right, that a key scene in the development of the romance between Newland and Olenska is set in this old Dutch house. So just let's take a look at this moment. They were walking past the house of the old patroon, with its squat walls and small square windows compactly grouped about a central chimney. The shutters stood wide, and through one of the newly washed windows, Archer caught the light of a fire. "Why, the house is open," he said. She stood still. "No, only for today at least. I wanted to see it, and Mr. van der Luyden had lit the fire and the windows opened, so that we might stop there on the way back from church this morning." She ran up the steps and tried the door. "It's still unlocked. What luck. Come in and we can have a quiet talk. Mr. van der Luyden has driven over to see her old aunts at Rhinebeck, and we shan't be missed at the house for another hour." He followed her into the narrow passage. His spirits, which had dropped at her last words, rose with an irrational leap. The homely little house stood there, its panels and brasses shining in the firelight, as if magically created to receive them. A big bed of embers still gleamed in the kitchen chimney, under an iron pot hung from an ancient crane. Rush-bottomed armchairs faced each other across the tiled hearth, and rows of Delft plates stood on shelves against the walls. Archer stopped over and threw a log upon the embers. So again, notice, just like in Ellen Olenska's room when he visits her, we have a fire, right? There's something, obviously, about the imagery of fire that is associated with Ellen. May is constantly associated with cold, with ice, right? With the opposite descriptions. And again, the emphasis here is that this is an old historic house. It's almost as if Ellen and Newland, they can't be together in the present, in their present, in the 1870s, because of social convention, obviously. So a lot of their meetings seem to be in places that are, in some way, explicitly described as being not the present in some way, or away from the present. So Ellen Olenska's living room, right? Ellen Olenska's room was different from other houses, right, in New York at the time. It had this European exotic flavor to it with different kinds of paintings. And this house, again, is not like the rest of New York. It is old. It is historic. So if we keep reading, Madame Olenska, dropping her cloak, sat down in one of the chairs. Archer leaned against the chimney and looked at her. "You're laughing now, but when you wrote me you were unhappy," he said. "Yes," she paused, "but I can't feel unhappy when you're here." "I shan't be here long," he rejoined, his lips stiffening with the effort to say just so much and no more. "No, I know that I'm improvident. I live in the moment when I'm happy." The words stole through him like a temptation, and to close his sense to it, he moved away from the hearth and stood gazing out at the black tree boles against the snow. But it was as if she too had shifted her place, and he still saw her, between himself and the trees, drooping over the fire with her indolent smile. Archer's heart was beating insubordinately. What if it were from him that she had been running away? And if she had waited to tell him so till they were here alone together in this secret room? So again, just notice the tension, right, in that scene, the erotic tension that Edith Wharton is so good at creating and sustaining. So this tension that we've been describing, it exists for the first half of the novel, right? The first half of the novel, and again, the novel is brilliantly structured. It builds this tension to the middle of the novel. And eventually, Newland is basically ready to leave May. He has decided he wants to be with Ellen. He has changed his mind. He is no longer that conventional man. And in this case, Ellen also says that she loves Newland. They kiss, but she says she can't betray her cousin. She can't betray May. And so she doesn't want to go through with this. And essentially the tension breaks there. And that's the end of the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is a lot sadder. The tension now is, so Newland goes through with his wedding. He is now married to May. And now he's constantly thinking of Ellen, wishing to see her again, wanting to see her again. And so the second half of the novel is all about, will he find her again? And will she agree to be his mistress? Now, there's a lot of scenes we could talk about in this, but I think there's one big important scene, which is when they do finally go away together. So this is in chapter 23. And so I want to look at this particular scene because, the one thing about this novel is that there's no explicit sex scene, right, between Ellen and Newland, right? They kiss at the end of the first part, but there is this scene that I believe is Edith Wharton's implicit way of suggesting that they begin an affair. And I think that's what happens in this scene, is it's not stated on the page, partly because, again, the social conventions, even of Edith Wharton's time, right, not depicting something like this on the page. But I believe it's there between the lines. So I want to look at this scene at the end of chapter 23. Seated side by side on a bench of the half-empty boat, they found that they had hardly anything to say to each other, or rather that what they had to say communicated itself best in the blessed silence of their release and their isolation. So again, the key emphasis here is that they're finally able to kind of be together like this because they're away from society. It's important that this does not happen in New York, this reunion. This happens outside of New York, right, where they are able to escape. Notice the words that Edith Wharton uses there, release and isolation. As the paddle wheels began to turn, and wharves and shipping to recede through the veil of heat, it seemed to Archer that everything in the old familiar world of habit was receding also. He longed to ask Madame Olenska if she did not have the same feeling, the feeling that they were starting on some long voyage from which they might never return. But he was afraid to say it, or anything else that might disturb the delicate balance of her trust in him. In reality, he had no wish to betray that trust. There had been days and nights when the memory of their kiss had burned and burned on his lips. The day before even, on the drive to Portsmouth, the thought of her had run through him like fire. Again, notice the imagery of fire. Always fire when it comes to Ellen. But now that she was beside him, and they were drifting forth into this unknown world, they seemed to have reached the kind of deeper nearness that a touch may sunder. So the idea here is that their relationship is deepening now, beyond just the passion of before. As the boat left the harbor and turned seaward, A breeze stirred about them, and the bay broke up into long, oily undulations, then into ripples tipped with spray. The fog of sultriness still hung over the city, but ahead lay a fresh world of ruffled waters and distant promontories with lighthouses in the sun. Madame Olenska, leaning back against the boat rail, drank in the coolness between parted lips. She had wound a long veil about her hat, but it left her face uncovered, and Archer was struck by the tranquil gaiety of her expression. She seemed to take their adventure as a matter of course, and to be neither in fear of unexpected encounters, nor, what was worse, unduly elated by their possibility. In the bare dining room of the inn, which he had hoped they would have to themselves, they found a strident party of innocent-looking young men and women, school teachers on a holiday, the landlord told them, and Archer's heart sank at the idea of having to talk through their noise. So again, he just wants to be alone with Ellen. And so this next paragraph, I think, is the key one that I really want to focus on here, the last paragraph of the chapter. This is hopeless. I'll ask for a private room, he said. And Madame Olenska, without offering any objection, waited while he went in search of it. The room opened on a long wooden veranda, with the sea coming in at the windows. It was bare and cool, with a table covered with a coarse checkered cloth and adorned by a bottle of pickles and a blueberry pie under a cage. No more guiltless-looking cabinet particulier ever offered its shelter to a clandestine couple. Archer fancied he saw the sense of its reassurance in the faintly amused smile with which Madame Olenska sat down opposite to him. A woman who had run away from her husband, and reputedly with another man, was likely to have mastered the art of taking things for granted. But something in the quality of her composure took the edge from his irony. By being so quiet, so unsurprised, and so simple, she had managed to brush away the conventions and make him feel that to seek to be alone was the natural thing for two old friends who had so much to say to each other. And then there's an ellipses as it trails off. Now, my theory might not be true, right? That this is an implied sex scene. But the reason I feel that this could be the case is just the way Edith Wharton writes those sentences, the emphasis on, oh yeah, it's totally guiltless for a clandestine couple, right? The sort of irony with which she writes this. The emphasis on Madame Olenska's experience with adultery and the way she brushes away the conventions. And then, of course, just this trailing off at the end of the chapter. Now, obviously, they could just be sitting in the room eating pickles and blueberry pie, right? But regardless of what Edith Wharton is suggesting or not suggesting, the whole point of this scene is it functions basically as a love scene would in a more conventional romantic comedy or a more conventional romance, because that is essentially, it's the equivalent of the scene in Titanic, right, with the two of them in the carriage in the middle of the movie. That's essentially what this is. The private room, just the two of them. That's the point of this scene, because the idea is they are finally together, away from other people, away from society, which would judge them. And it's so beautifully written, the emphasis on this scene, even the little details. This is an interesting lesson in, I think, the effectiveness of little details, because when I think of this scene, I actually think specifically of the pickles and the blueberry pie. Even though so much else happens in this scene, obviously, and those are just minor details. But there's something so specific about those details that they attach to that scene. And that's why I always say to students, there is no such thing as an irrelevant detail. Because if you can make a detail specific, your reader will associate that detail with the moment, even if it's not directly connected. I would hate for some editor to say, oh, the pickles are irrelevant, why don't you just cut them? No, the pickles are essential. The pickles are what give the scene its specificity. And the way we reference the scene, it's the scene on the boat, it's the scene where they're, in Boston, right, traveling around. But more specifically, it's the scene where they're in the room with the pickles and the blueberry pie. That's what makes the scene stand out. So just want to emphasize that there is no such thing as an irrelevant detail. If you are a master of craft like Edith Wharton, you will make those details relevant because they will associate themselves with that moment in the reader's mind. All right, let's look at a few more scenes here just to kind of conclude all of this. So obviously, the big scene, the scene that I love, the scene that stays in my mind for so long, is the museum scene. So this is in chapter 31. And again, the choice of the museum as a location is obviously so essential, right? Because Edith Wharton is trying to say something about history. It's a perfect New York setting, but also a perfect setting for the historical stuff, for the historical themes that Wharton is working with. So, this is in the middle of chapter 31. "Tomorrow I must see you, somewhere where we can be alone," he said, in a voice that sounded almost angry to his own ears. She wavered and moved toward the carriage. "But I shall be at Granny's, for the present, that is," she added, as if conscious that her change of plans required some explanation. "Somewhere where we can be alone," he insisted. She gave a faint laugh that grated on him. "In New York? But there are no churches, no monuments." "There's the art museum in the park," he explained, as she looked puzzled. "At 2:30, I shall be at the door." So jumping ahead now when they meet in the museum, a few lines down. Avoiding the popular Wolfe collection, whose anecdotic canvases filled one of the main galleries of the queer wilderness of cast iron and enthusiastic tiles known as the Metropolitan Museum, they had wandered down a passage to the room where the Cesnola antiquities moldered in unvisited loneliness. So notice they're having this next conversation in a room full of antiquities. Again, historic associations. That's the context in which they can be together. They had this melancholy retreat to themselves, and seated on the divan enclosing the central steam radiator, they were staring silently at the glass cabinets mounted in ebonized wood, which contained the recovered fragments of Ilium. So they're looking at sort of fragments from Troy, basically. "It's odd," Madame Olenska said. "I never came here before." "Ah, well, someday I suppose it will be a great museum." "Yes," she assented absently. She stood up and wandered across the room. Archer, remaining seated, watched the light movements of her figure, so girlish even under its heavy furs, the cleverly planted heron wing in her fur cap, and the way a dark curl lay like a flattened vine spiral on each cheek above the ear. His mind, as always when they first met, was wholly absorbed in the delicious details that made her herself and no other. Presently he rose and approached the case before which she stood. Its glass shelves were crowded with small broken objects, hardly recognizable domestic utensils, ornaments, and personal trifles, made of glass, of clay, of discolored bronze, and other time-blurred substances. Again, it's so important, this description. You cannot take it out of the scene, because the point is the tragedy of their love, right? At this point, they are sort of aware that it might not work, that they can't keep this going. The tragedy of their love is juxtaposed against history, against the passage of time. And when we look at the ending and how Edith Wharton concludes this novel with that final chapter, it's all going to come together so brilliantly. "It seems cruel," she said, "that after a while nothing matters, any more than these little things that used to be necessary and important to forgotten people, and now have to be guessed at under a magnifying glass and labeled use unknown." So Ellen is kind of lamenting that after a while, nothing matters. And obviously she's talking about the objects in front of her, but she's really talking about the society she lives in. She's sort of acknowledging that after many centuries, thousands of years, the little social trifles aren't really going to matter, right? The little details of their social world will be forgotten and will be irrelevant. Now Archer continues, "Yes, but meanwhile, meanwhile. As she stood there, in her long sealskin coat, her hands thrust in a small round muff, her veil drawn down like a transparent mask to the tip of her nose, and the bunch of violets he had brought her stirring with her quickly taken breath, it seemed incredible that this pure harmony of line and color should ever suffer the stupid law of change. Meanwhile, everything matters. That concerns you, he said. She looked at him thoughtfully and turned back to the divan. He sat down beside her and waited, but suddenly he heard a step echoing far off down the empty room and felt the pressure of the minutes. So again, now suddenly someone's coming and this conversation is going to have to end soon, right? The moment that they're able to steal together can't last. Let's talk about the ending now. So let's talk about where this all leads to, what this all builds to, and how this whole novel ends. So there's sort of, I think, two endings, right? There's the main climactic ending that's set in the 1870s. And that, of course, is when, Ellen and Newland are carrying on their affair. And there's this brilliant scene right towards the end where Archer seems to realize that everyone already knew about their affair, that they had kept trying to hide it this whole time. They kept trying to hide it. They kept worrying they would hurt May. They didn't want to go through with it. They kept trying to find these moments alone. And he realizes eventually that actually everybody knows and everybody has known. And again, what that moment I think represents at the end is society rearing its head again, right? New York society of the 1870s, as I think that's the real antagonist of the novel. In a love story, obviously the antagonist is the person, right, the main character is pursuing. That's how a love story is often structured. But in this case, as we saw from the very first chapter, it's really New York society that represents the antagonist, because they're the ones whose values Newland and Ellen are trying to challenge. And in the end, society wins. And specifically, May wins. And there's this wonderful phrase that Edith Wharton uses at the end of this chapter to describe May. Her blue eyes wet with victory, right? She's crying, yet she's victorious. Now, the real ending, though, of the novel is we jump ahead in time in the final chapter, 26 years later, closer to the time Edith Wharton was writing this novel. And I think this is where the novel's brilliance really comes through, because you could have ended the story in the 1870s, and maybe a lesser author would have done that. But remember, Edith Wharton is not just telling a love story. She is telling a story about history and about time. And so it's already quite tragic. Newland and Ellen can't be together despite their love for each other. The values of New York society defeat them, right? Their nonconformity is not powerful enough to withstand the era they live in. That itself is already so tragic. But what makes it hit so much harder is the ending. So we've jumped ahead. May is dead by this point, and Newland is an old man, right? His son is all grown up. And there's this profoundly sad passage where Newland reflects on his life and in particular on Ellen. So this is in the last chapter, kind of towards the middle. Something he knew he had missed, the flower of life. But he thought of it now as a thing so unattainable and improbable that to have repined would have been like despairing because one had not drawn the first prize in a lottery. There were 100 million tickets in his lottery, and there was only one prize. The chances had been too decidedly against him. When he thought of Ellen Olenska, it was abstractly, serenely, as one might think of some imaginary beloved in a book or a picture. She had become the composite vision of all that he had missed. That vision, faint and tenuous as it was, had kept him from thinking of other women. He had been what was called a faithful husband, and when May had suddenly died, carried off by the infectious pneumonia through which she had nursed their youngest child, he had honestly mourned her. Their long years together had shown him that It did not so much matter if marriage was a dull duty, as long as it kept the dignity of a duty. Lapsing from that, it became a mere battle of appetites. Looking about him, he honored his own past and mourned for it. After all, there was good in the old ways. So that is just a profoundly sad and melancholic passage. So obviously the phrasing, he knew he had missed the flower of life, right? He realizes that despite all the things he accomplishes in his life, he missed the essential thing. He missed the flower. And now he sort of thinks of her, again, the phrase that's used, she had become the composite vision of all that he had missed. But notice how that passage ends. It doesn't end on his melancholy, and that's what makes it so tragic. We see him essentially rationalize losing Ellen. He sort of says, okay, yeah, my marriage was a duty. It wasn't very good, but it was a duty and I did it. And then that final really tragic phrase where he says, after all, there was good in the old ways. Again, we have the return here of Edith Wharton's irony. Because of course Edith Wharton does not think there was good in the old ways. This whole novel has been a critique of the old ways. And so when Newland says this here, it should hit us as readers in the heart. Because we realize not only did he lose Ellen, not only did he lose the person he describes as the flower of his life, but he doesn't even seem to fully realize how much he's lost. He's rationalized the loss and said to himself, well, there is some good stuff in the old ways. Now, this passage is so sad too, because think about what Ellen said in the museum during that scene when they were standing together. What did she say? It seems cruel that after a while nothing matters. Then we jump ahead and we realize that Ellen was right. After a while nothing matters. May is dead and the world has changed. And it's that last point, that the world has changed, that I think Wharton uses to really drive home the tragedy of Newland's life. Because the way this final chapter is written, it kind of depicts his children as being free of the restrictive social conventions of the 1870s. They are new people in a new world who are not kind of caged in by society the way Newland was. And we see this in Newland's interaction with his son towards the end of the novel. So they're in Paris, and we have that passage that we read where Newland is reflecting on the tragedy of not having Ellen. But what they learn is that Ellen is actually in Paris, that Ellen Olenska is in Paris. And basically Newland thinks he can see her again, right? There's a chance that he can see her again. She's there. She's in Paris. Now, for a moment, we think, does this mean there will be a happy ending after all? May is dead. Newland has acknowledged to himself that Ellen was the flower of his life. Now she is here in Paris. And his son basically encourages him to go see her. So let's look at this scene towards the end. And notice the way Dallas, Newland's son, is depicted as so cheerful and free and vibrant. He does not have any of the hang-ups that Newland did because he is part of a different world. And Edith Wharton is really emphasizing that for the next generation, for Dallas and for everyone in his generation, the old ways no longer apply. They have freed themselves from those restrictive social conventions. So this is toward the end of the chapter. Dallas's hand came down cheerily on his shoulder. "Hello, Father. This is something like, isn't it?" They stood for a while looking out in silence, and then the young man continued. "By the way, I've got a message for you. The Countess Olenska expects us both at 5:30. He said it lightly, carelessly, as he might have imparted any casual item of information, such as the hour at which the train was to leave for Florence the next evening. Archer looked at him and thought he saw in his gay young eyes a gleam of his great-grandmother Mingott's malice. "Oh, didn't I tell you?" Dallas pursued. Fanny made me swear to do 3 things while I was in Paris. Get her the score of the last Debussy songs, go to the Grand Guignol, and see Madame Olenska. You know she was awfully good to Fanny when Mr. Beaufort sent her over from Buenos Aires to the Assumption. Fanny hadn't any friends in Paris, and Madame Olenska used to be kind to her and trot her about on holidays. I believe she was a great friend of the first Mrs. Beaufort's, and she's our cousin, of course. So I rang her up this morning before I went out and told her you and I were here for 2 days and wanted to see her. Archer continued to stare at him. You told her I was here. Of course. Why not? Dallas's eyebrows went up whimsically. Then, getting no answer, he slipped his arm through his father's with a confidential pressure. I say, Father, what was she like? Archer felt his color rise under his son's unabashed gaze. Come, own up. You and she were great pals, weren't you? Wasn't she most awfully lovely? Now again, Edith Wharton is so smart with dialogue. That word pals is perfect because it sums up, obviously it's ironic, right? Obviously they were so much more than pals, and Wharton deploys that word so artfully there through the character of Dallas. Lovely? I don't know. She was different. Ah, there you have it. That's what it always comes to, doesn't it? When she comes, she's different, and one doesn't know why. It's exactly what I feel about Fanny. So that's important because he links Archer's love of Ellen to his love of Fanny. Except the point is, for Dallas, for this younger generation, nothing's going to stand in his way. He's going to be able to be with the woman he loves in a way that Archer could not because of the times he lived in. That's the real tragedy of the ending of the Age of Innocence, right? Is that what Wharton is sort of saying is exactly what Ellen said in the museum. After a while, nothing matters. Those old social conventions disappear. And that's exactly what happens even just over the course of a few decades, right? By the 1900s, all of the old social conventions have disappeared, and Archer's son is unburdened by any of that. Any of the things that Archer and Ellen were burdened by. And so Archer basically does not want to see her. He says he can't see her. And let's look at the dialogue here. Dallas's reaction is really interesting. He says, Dash it, Dad, don't be prehistoric. Wasn't she once your Fanny? And again, that word prehistoric. It's only a few decades ago, but to Dallas it might as well be prehistoric, right? His father's set of values. Now look at this next paragraph. Dallas belonged body and soul to the new generation. He was the firstborn of Newland and May Archer, yet it had never been possible to inculcate in him even the rudiments of reserve. What's the use of making mysteries? It only makes people want to nose 'em out, he always objected when enjoined to discretion. But Archer, meeting his eyes, saw the filial light under the banter. My Fanny? Well, the woman you'd have chucked everything for. Only you didn't, continued his surprising son. I didn't, echoed Archer with a kind of solemnity. No, you date, you see, dear old boy. But Mother said... Your mother? Yes, the day before she died. It was when she sent for me alone, you remember? She said she knew we were safe with you and always would be, because once, when she asked you to, you'd given up the thing you most wanted. Archer received this strange communication in silence. His eyes remained unseeingly fixed on the thronged sunlit square below the window. At length, he said in a low voice, She never asked me. God, it's so tragic, isn't it, to hear Archer reflecting on the choices that he made, the choices that he felt he was forced to make. And again, this contrast between father and son. Once again, I think, some editor might say, get rid of all this. You don't need this final epilogue. Just end the novel in the 1870s. But look at how much you would lose. Look at the devastating beauty of this final section in which Edith Wharton reinforces for us what she's trying to say about history, what she's trying to say about the passage of time. And I think the most tragic part of all of this is, well, let's look at a few more quotes, because I think a lot of what Dallas says is Edith Wharton kind of speaking directly to the generation before her, to the generation when she was young, to the world that she is satirizing. No, I forgot. This is Dallas speaking. No, I forgot. You never did ask each other anything, did you? And you never told each other anything. You just sat and watched each other and guessed at what was going on underneath. A deaf and dumb asylum, in fact. Well, I back your generation for knowing more about each other's private thoughts than we ever have time to find out about our own. So, again, Dallas is sort of making fun of things, doing it lightly, but he hits upon a truth there. It is interesting, right? Because he says, you just sat and watched each other and guessed at what was going on underneath. The real irony there is, actually, Newland and Ellen were able to create a real, true intimacy where they did know each other's thoughts. So they actually had transcended the limitations of their generation. But the tragedy, of course, is that they couldn't maintain that transcendence. Eventually, they got pulled back in. And so the final moments of the novel, Archer decides not to visit Olenska with his son. I think that's the final key decision that Archer makes. So let's look at the very end. So they arrive at Ellen Olenska's place, and he basically tells his son to go up without him. Dallas paused before him, visibly bewildered. But I say, Dad, do you mean you won't come up at all? I don't know, said Archer slowly. If you don't, she won't understand. Go, my boy. Perhaps I shall follow you. Dallas gave him a long look through the twilight. But what on earth shall I say? My dear fellow, don't you always know what to say? His father rejoined with a smile. Very well. I shall say you're old-fashioned and prefer walking up the 5 flights because you don't like lifts. His father smiled again. Say I'm old-fashioned. That's enough. And so then Dallas goes up, and Archer sits down on the bench and imagines his son walking into the room, right? It says right here, he pictured Dallas entering the room with his quick, assured step and his delightful smile, and wondered if the people were right who said that his boy took after him. So in other words, like, people have been told him that Dallas looks like him, or Dallas looks like he used to look. And now he's thinking about that association, that similarity. And then he imagines Ellen. Then he tried to see the persons already in the room. For probably at that sociable hour there would be more than one. And among them, a dark lady, pale and dark, who would look up quickly, half rise, and hold out a long thin hand with 3 rings on it. He thought she would be sitting in a sofa corner near the fire, with azaleas banked behind her on a table. It's more real to me here than if I went up, he suddenly heard himself say, and the fear lest that last shadow of reality should lose its edge kept him rooted to his seat as the minutes succeeded each other. He sat for a long time on the bench in the thickening dusk, his eyes never turning from the balcony. At length a light shone through the windows, and a moment later a manservant came out on the balcony, drew up the awnings, and closed the shutters. At that, as if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to his hotel. So in the end, he decides not to go up because he can't. And I think there's so much under the surface going on here. So on the one hand, we have that line in which Wharton says, yeah, Dallas looks like Newland, takes after him. And then Newland imagines Ellen in the room looking up as Dallas enters. Now, Wharton doesn't say it, but I think what she's implying here is, imagine you're Ellen Olenska. You're sitting in this room. You see Dallas come in, and he looks just like Newland used to look when Newland was young. And if you're Ellen Olenska, it's almost like you're seeing a ghost. You're seeing the man you were once in love with. And it's almost like time travel for Ellen. You know, she reaches out a long, thin hand with 3 rings on it. It's almost like she's reaching for Newland, for the past. It's kind of like Ellen, for a moment, experiences time travel. She goes back to the 1870s when she and Newland were in love. But of course, this is realist fiction. This is a novel written in the 20th century, and there is no time travel. And Edith Wharton knows that. And it's her really bittersweet and tragic way of saying, you cannot go back and redo the past. And so Newland knows that and recognizes that, and he decides to get up and walk away. And that is this ultimate tragedy of this novel, right? This novel which depicted this beautiful, passionate, intense love story, right, in the first half, just built and built and built this immense tension through these two wonderful characters who were falling in love, and then that breaks your heart through the way society crushes them, the way history crushes them. And as if that's not enough, Wharton does one final move at the end where she says, and in the end, it didn't even matter, because several decades later, everything had changed. And it's like she's saying, if only Newland Archer and Ellen Olenska had lived in a different era, had been born in a different time, then they could have been together. If they had been born 30 years later, they could have been together. And so the real tragedy of this novel is not this timeless tragedy of, a broken romance, a broken love story. It is the even more tragic, specific, historically specific tragedy of the brutal social conventions of a conservative era. And I think that's why this novel is so brilliant. Edith Wharton is basically, through this novel, saying the world of the 1870s was not a good world. It was a world in which people could not be themselves, in which society and convention prevented people from being themselves. And the real tragedy is that this social world disappeared so quickly. But for the people who grew up in it, for the people who lived in it, it's always going to haunt them. And like Newland, they're never going to be able to be happy. Again, just a masterpiece of a novel. And that's why I think it's worth going longer in this podcast, because a novel like The Age of Innocence deserves to be analyzed and spoken of at this length. It is a genuine masterpiece. And we're going to talk about other Edith Wharton books on this podcast. We're going to talk about The House of Mirth, which is also very tragic. That I actually find The Age of Innocence the most tragic of all of Edith Wharton's books because of what it says about history. And I think, again, to come back to the larger themes that we talked about at the beginning, the reason the passage of time and the reason history is such a moving and profound theme that writers tackle is that it's not something we can ever undo, right? The years go by, the decades go by, the world changes, society changes, history changes, but we can only live it in one direction, and we can only live it once. And that's the real tragedy that great writers like Edith Wharton are able to capture in these novels. All right, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for listening. Next time, we're going to talk about E.M. Forster's Howard's End, another wonderful novel written around the same time as The Age of Innocence. And yeah, until then, take care, and thank you for listening.